Hey everybody, how you guys doing? I'm Eric Gerlach, and this is a video on the Greek philosopher Democritus in my series on videos on Greek philosophy and philosophers and its interrelation with the history of human thought, including Indian and Chinese thought. So Democritus lived around 460 to 370 BCE, other side of Jesus, and has been mentioned as the laughing philosopher, as opposed to Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher, by Juvenal, the Roman poet and playwright. Democritus was known in his hometown of Abdera as the mocker, who liked to mock people. Ridicule is an old human tool. Apparently, if Steve goes off and shoots a huge caribou and comes back and says, "I shot a huge caribou," people are like, "Yeah, isn't that great, Steve? Look at this jerk." Like using mockery and skeptical laughter is a ancient old-fashioned human tool, and apparently Democritus did that well. So he laughed at the foolishness of people as he studied and traveled in search of wisdom. Abdera was a city to the north of Athens in Thrace. So that means the Thracians are sometimes portrayed with reddish hair and blue eyes. So these would be more northern, lighter-skinned people without there being necessarily white or black, quote, quote, people at the time. We'll get to Aristotle and him calling people having various complexions and color temporarily with health, but these are those who Xenophanes said portray the gods as having red hair. So Leucippus, the original Greek atomist from Miletus, taught Democritus, and the two shared a common conception of the cosmos, along with similar atomists like Kanada of India of the Vaisheshika school. Aristotle was supposedly from North Athens, and he knew Democritus's work very well. Plato hated him and apparently wanted his books burned, according to one source. Democritus's father was very wealthy, and he had ties to Persia. He was said to have received Xerxes and entertained him in his army, as Xerxes was passing through on his way back from overrunning Athens, and others supporting the Ionian rebellion against Persia. This is the whole 300 thing. In gratitude, Xerxes left behind several Magi, the Zoroastrian scholar priests. The 300 thing was them finally trying to kick the Persians out. So the Magi, and many say this is where we get our word magic from the Greeks saying, well, whatever the Magi do is some scientific magic something or other. I believe Arthur C. Clarke said, magic is technology you do not understand. That Xerxes left behind several priest, scientist, scholar folks of the Persians. Again, the Greeks did not invent scholarship or history or what we would call science, I would argue. But yes, had folks who speculated cosmologically about things, as did the Egyptians and the Persians, and we have fragments of what the Persians and the Egyptians did, especially translated today. So Democritus was said to have been taught by Ostanes, I am not sure, I was not there, a Zoroastrian Magi. One source quotes Democritus as saying he would rather make a single great discovery than be emperor of Persia, which is like Heraclitus choosing the philosopher over the political position, the mind over the body, the mental over the physical. Democritus traveled extensively, which he could afford. He went to Persia, India, Egypt, and Ethiopia, supposedly. He lived in Egypt for some years, and he praised Egyptian mathematics like Pythagoras. Some say he studied with Anaxagoras in Athens, but all Democritus tells us is that when he went to Athens, no one knew him. Philosophy has yet to somewhat get going in Athens, again at this time. It is just now starting to get going. For the atomists, there are two primary elements. We talked about Parmenides in the Eleatic Challenge already with the Parmenides video. There are being and non-being. Atoms are beings. They are alike in being indivisible pure beings. Non-being is the void in which atoms move. The atoms are infinitely many. The void is singular. Atoms are indivisible, an answer to Parmenides' Eleatic Challenge regarding division as an infinite regress. That Parmenides says being and non-being cannot mix and interbe, and non-being can't be at all. Technically, this is saying no, non-being is as the absence everything else moves in, and that solves Parmenides' problems. That would be what atomism is for, somewhat, is to solve problems of infinite regress in human thought, because atoms are undividables that are the sub-level of atomic axiomatic being. Now, if things are infinitely divisible, you can keep having things not being entirely atomic the whole way down. This is actually quite similar. I happen to be a Wittgensteinian myself very much. Bertrand Russell, with whom Wittgenstein himself studied, he believed in atomic truth, at least for a decent chunk of his career, most of it, which means positivistically, Russell believes that you can break things down to just the facts, ma'am, and have the atomic pieces of meaning and truth of a situation. If you are more so pragmatic and Wittgensteinian, you would certainly argue that we can't break things down to simply the facts without having purposes for specific situations. Without that, you cannot have atomic meaning and truth, because things don't boil down to fire is simply hot, yes, now we have simply fact completely. This issue of atomism also figures into epistemology, into our study of knowledge, because if there aren't atoms and atoms are infinitely divisible, in a different way, how can there be atomic truth and fact if the situation and meaning can be differently construed depending on the situation? Are there fundamental building blocks of meaning? Levy Strauss famously tried to argue with structuralist thought in France that incest is always wrong. Well, unfortunately, we can say, along with Levy Strauss and a lot of terrible things on the internet, if that were true, no one would ever discuss it in the ever-loving slightest. It would almost be invisible. And unfortunately, if people wrestle back and forth with structuralism and incest and how humanity works, then there isn't a building block of incest is always wrong. And if you don't have that as a building block, then what building blocks will you have of meaning with apples being good to eat? Well, the Freudian Levi Strauss tried to boil things down to prohibition of incest because, of course, he wanted something like sex or violence prohibition as opposed to apples, which can come and go, but sex and violence is ever present, it would seem, in life. So he was trying to boil something down to axiomatic meaning, much as these atomists were trying to boil down physical reality to atoms. Neither have succeeded so far entirely, and that does create these same problems of the infinite regress created in the work of Parmenides. Well, he didn't create these infinite regresses, it would seem. That with all of this, they were like that when he got here, I swear, and Zeno, he was in on it, I swear, is that all of this are still problems we can psychologically find with the human mind and meaning today. Can we break things down to their fundamental parts? They were trying against Parmenides to do so. So, Democritus also thought that atoms connect with hooks and sockets like Legos or Tinker Toys or something. I don't know if the kids have Tinker Toys today, but the shape and features of atoms give substances their properties, either by purity or mixture. So metal atoms have hooks and are rigid, water atoms are slippery and round, and salt atoms are sharp, hence the taste. So, which, of course, if you do not have microscopes, you would think something must be like that. Like the Jains believe there's microscopic creatures, they're right. They then believe they look like tiny elephants and other things, which, of course, they don't, but then again, they did not have microscopes to see all of that while they were fasting in the jungle and having visions of what must be in other worlds, etc., while one sits by the electronic microscope, with the protein bar, perhaps. So, life and consciousness is itself decently made of fire atoms. I do advise people to understand, in the ancient world, consciousness would be very much identified with fire and light, and that is decently material. It's that people in the ancient world would not, like Thales says all things are full of gods and spirits, they would not have thought fire is not conscious, so consciousness in the mind comes somewhat from fire. This is neither materialist nor spiritualist. It's all of that all together, especially in the ancient world, like with the thinkers we've been talking about so far. So the fire in us is what allows human beings to move and think. Like many would see electricity in the wall and think it's electricity in the brain that allows us to move and think, when it would be everything in the human body and mind, and then some of it more so directly sparking activity. Notice the spark and the metaphor. So like Anaxagoras, who Democritus praises, salt is as basic as fire. Democritus extends Anaxagoras' theories we were just covering with atomism. However, unlike Anaxagoras, but like Heraclitus, oddly, Democritus makes the soul from fire rather than abstract mind, which is the uber element itself for Anaxagoras. Leucippus and Democritus noted that material things decompose given time, but are also regenerated, so they seem to mix and unmix. Fire is gone, then it comes back. This is because the fire atoms themselves do not change, but the mixture of that and then fire into the smoke, into the earth, and the earth going upward as smoke mixed into the air. All of this is air, fire, water, and other elements combining. So atoms exist in void. Again, in this supposedly is as eternal void as the atoms themselves and unchanging. That is not modern theory, but modern theory might say the same or not of quarks. I am not the modern cosmologist. You can check with them. I would say, however, to any modern cosmologist, the things you are trying to keep permanent versus impermanent are things the Greeks are wrestling with, as are other thinkers in India and China. And as of yet, which parts are simply formally eternal is a very deep problem of the human mind. Because how can something have a form along with Parmenides and be completely eternal? It goes along with Hesiod. If the gods are born, philosophers come along and they say, but wait a minute, Hesiod, if the gods are born, how are they not dying? Seems like anything that's continuously born is continuously dying, a la Heraclitus. So again, are there forms of things that are eternal and unchanging? Well, this deals exactly with that. Newton agreed there was indeed void, absolute space. Einstein, of course, somewhat relativizes this and links time and space to having particular more so properties rather than being pure universal empty fields as such. And again, consult with others. I would say read Feyerabend's Against Method. I do like that book. But, of course, consult with those who know Newton and Einstein a bit more about that. So, Democritus is somewhat the opposite of Anaxagoras, though, even as he borrows from him. Anaxagoras believed Parmenides was right because total separation from things is an illusion. Things are separate. For Democritus and the atomists, atoms remain distinct, though. So, this somewhat solves these problems again. For Democritus, what appears to be complete unity is ignorance of the underlying separation, somewhat opposite for Anaxagoras. For Anaxagoras, what appears to be complete separation is ignorance of the underlying connection. That is decently Heraclitus versus Parmenides, which is that all is change versus all is the same, which means sameness is illusion versus change is illusion. You find all of these positions dueling it out back and forth in the human mind in India, in Greece, and in China. Democritus thought that cosmologically, the world was round and that there were other worlds, some with many suns and moons, others without any suns or moons. This is somewhat like Indian thought, and Democritus was said to have traveled to India. Worlds are formed by the collision and combination of atoms in the void. Worlds are born and then die this way, colliding with other worlds. So he seems to think that, although that is very true, he doesn't seem to understand solar systems, of course. He seems to think that there's just very much like atoms smashing into each other or not. Planets just smash into each other or not. And so why do they sort of go round? Well, yes. That's confusing. And again, we don't have all the details to fill all this in or ask the guy, so it's hard to know. So, for Democritus, the world is amassing in size, but the atoms remain eternally distinct even if it's increasingly joined in combination with each other. So, Democritus says we cannot also know ultimate truth. He says rather skeptically. And aside from the fact that Democritus was a very committed atomist, you find him actually arguing that much is subjective and we don't know anything entirely. He sounds a bit like Locke of modern British and European thought, who says there is objectivity, there is objective knowledge, but it's always somewhat of a subjective combination of various elements, which of course that brings up the very Wittgensteinian problem versus Russell. So wait a minute, if it's always subjective and various and situational, what part of it is the objective form then? And Locke and Democritus definitely give it an objective form that it may or may not have in their work, but admitting, but by the way, it's always known empirically and via the imperfect human senses and reason and mind, which is interesting. But again, there's a flaw back and forth somewhere in there about how you get your objective out of what is always subjective, which Hegel says, and I do like, is the major issue. One of the major issues of human philosophy is the ever-present question of what is more objective and what is more subjective of this here right that we're arguing in India, Greece, China, Islam, the world, all over the place. Democritus says very skeptically, like the later Greek skeptics who are coming about a little after this time, we cannot know ultimate truth. It is beyond our perception, just as the atoms and other worlds themselves are beyond our perception, the planets and the tiny little things bumping around in the microphone I'm yelling at here. But we can put it together with the mind through reason. This is very similar, again, to a lot of thinkers in complicated ways in Greece and European thought, as well as the world. The atoms influence influence us as we interact with them, technically as our atoms interact with foreign atoms, but we cannot perceive the interactions. Rather, we must use reason to figure it out, must intuit the elephant beyond the limbs of the elephant. Still true of modern physics, whether or not you find people saying there is the set form or, well, there is the theory and the models. The skeptical philosopher of science Feyerabend does say the size of electron had been shrinking in recent decades up till his death, meaning they were little moons, and then increasingly they are fields, not little moons, but people thought of electrons as little moons, and they sort of are. Again, consult others on that. But Bohr first conceived of the atom as a small solar system, as Feyerabend points out, and it is ceasing to be a solar system as we learn about it. So if all of this in historical context seems a little silly and speculative, it's not only linked up to our modern thinking, but of course our modern thinking is somewhat similarly, as Democritus himself said, trying to speak of things we cannot perceive by applying form to it, and we will get through a lot of that and the issues with that with each and every Platonic dialogue that we go through after this. And Plato and Aristotle are trying to finish off Greek philosophy somewhat, knowing of Democritus and all of those who are before and follow him. So some say that Democritus blinded himself so he could pursue his studies without distraction, which would put reason above the senses, oddly enough. It would fit with that. This seems unlikely, though. Again, I don't know how he would learn better that-a-ways, because he still needs the empirical senses to see something. Democritus argued that fire atoms make our minds are impressed upon by formations of atoms from outside, which forms images or idols of things, or mental conceptions. Aristotle later follows with a similar theory, and again, this somewhat is like Hume and tabula rasa empiricists. Democritus said, reason is a powerful persuader, which seems a bit Nietzsche and a bit Heraclitus, as well as Hume saying truth is prejudice, practice, and passion. He says habit, prejudice, and assumption, etc. Also, similar to all of this, Democritus says that things which are good are good in some situations and bad in others, giving deep water as an example. Skeptics and more subjective thinkers are all about examples of things that are good in one case and bad in another, and you have Archilochos and Sappho, the two most famous of archaic Greek poets, saying before any of these philosophers, remember that when times are good, times are bad, and remember I see her as more beautiful than a set of war chariots, says history's most famous lesbian, Sappho. So Democritus is saying after Sappho and Archilochos, things are good or bad depending on their situation. Deep water is a wonderful example, because Democritus himself says deep water is, you can drown in deep water if you can't swim, but if you have a boat, you need deep water, otherwise your boat is up on the shore and cannot sail, is sandbarred, etc. Obviously, I'm a sailor like the ancient Greeks. Bad can come of things we believe are simply good when we are ignorant, which is very true. Everyone on all sides of politics would accuse someone else of that. According to some sources, Democritus believed that the gods are enormous beings that live in the air, which communicate through dreams and images, the sources of belief in gods and prophecy. According to others, Democritus did not believe the gods were real, but rather people witnessed extraordinary things in the air like thunder and lightning, and attributed it to human-like beings. Either way, that does not actually tell us that Democritus did not believe that there are godlike beings out there. It may be very likely that he believes there's large, very much like Epicurus, there's maybe large beings out there. These guys would often think the world was alive and the cosmos was alive. He just may think that thinking Athena is very much like Xenophanes and Heraclitus. Thinking Athena is a goddess who's good-looking in armor is ridiculous, because that's very human and that's not bird-like. Would possibly be what Democritus is thinking, and that is very similar to Heraclitus, as well as Skepticism, which becomes an official philosophy by that name in Greece. The skeptics say, and it seems like in this economy, life is fair and life is unfair both. Depends on your perspective and which way you stare down the duck rabbit, doesn't it? So that would be a wonderful thing. You can see life as very fair, you can see life as very unfair, etc. Democritus said, with regard to the gods, man is what we know. Humanity is what we got. Confucius famously said, "You're trying to serve ghosts and spirits. You don't know how to feed people yet." He is not saying similarly, don't feed the ghosts and spirits. He is saying, but you're more worried about that than you are actually feeding people. If you feed a lot of people, probably you'll have happier ghosts and spirits. This is not that he didn't believe in the gods, ghosts, and spirits. It's similar with Democritus in the ancient Greek world, as it is in the ancient Chinese world with Confucius. So Democritus believed the verses of Homer were too beautiful to not be divinely inspired, and was reported to have said, only those who hate injustice are loved by the gods. Again, there's probably forces he believes are out there, and again, any of this could be misattributed to him or not, and we never know about any of this entirely, like history itself, continuously, which involves politics and science, sadly, and us having any self-awareness of our practices. So, like Xenophanes, Democritus seems to believe there are gods and divinity, but our understandings are quite limited and human with eyes and ears. Similar to Heraclitus, Heraclitus believed Homer should be beaten for all of this publicly, for misleading people into common Greek culture. Like Empedocles, Democritus was critical of tyranny, arguing that equality is superior to tyranny. Unfortunately, like the American founding fathers, this probably did not extend to all of the people entirely. He mockingly said that in some cities are ruled by men who are slaves to their women, and that being ruled by a woman is the final insult for a man. I am sure there's many an online male somewhere who has something to say or has about anything like that. He also said that women should not be permitted to argue, as it was a terrible thing. He does not specify, I have to say here, a bit egalitarian in Berserkly Town, whether or not it is terrible when women argue because women are bad at arguing, or whenever women argue, it has somewhat terrible consequences for the men in their life. In my family, I like to joke, that the women are unintelligent and can't figure out what you're up to, aren't logical enough, was not the problem, unfortunately. They're always figuring you out. But yes, he is not specific about all of that. It is like the ancient Egyptian wisdom quote, which says, your woman is like a fertile field, so be nice to her and give her cosmetics and all oil for her limbs, but do not get into court with her, and do not let her take over your house. Which tells you, well, that sounds like women are taking over households, in Greece and Egypt, and life is life, dear fellow. Again, as the French say, vive la de France, after they're done saying vive la France. Epic puns, etc. for you. So, Epicurus, we're going to study him near the end of the course, explicitly invited women and slaves into his garden, and that ain't Democritus too much. So Democritus believed a life of moderation and discipline results in happiness. Just as medicine heals sickness in a body, wisdom removes desire from the mind. Wisdom is superior to knowledge, as he says, many have much learning and no thought. One should cultivate much thought, not much learning. This is an interesting issue for Confucius and Chinese philosophy. There are three sources, not just three, but in Chinese thought and Indian thought, there is definitely at least knowledge, acquiring knowledge, there is meditation, and there is physical discipline. And there are different thinkers of Jain's Buddhists and other Chinese thinkers who do believe, like Taoists, well, fasting, meditation, and knowledge study, all that's important or not, or maybe you should just stop reading and go off and fast. Confucius specifically says he does not think fasting and meditation is good for you. He says learn and think and learn. So some think meditation and self-discipline, mind, body is good. Others say learn, and others say think. And various thinkers say this. Confucius himself says learning without thinking is useless. Thinking without learning is dangerous. And he also says don't meditate or fast. That's for idiots, which is not very hippie or very Buddhist or very Jain. So here, in fact, Democritus says, and I'll just offer, you should think more than you learn. That is definitely Taoist, and that is not Confucius. Confucius actually says that is a bit more dangerous than it is useless. Here, Confucius would sort of say being too much of a conservative and having knowledge set without thinking outside the box and progressing is useless. Conservative dogmatic thought would be a little too useless, but progressive thought for somewhat conservative Confucius is dangerous. Like, it's dangerous to be anarchistic, where it's useless and stupid to be Republican dad. In that sense, not trying to take the sides, although we're all on our sides and such, it's like it's better for Confucius to be a stupid Republican dad than stupid anarchist kid. But Democritus actually says here, one should cultivate much thought, not much learning, which actually he seems to suggest changing stuff up with your own personal thinking and your own anarchism is much better than being a lot of Republican dad and being very knowledgeable and having things set and steady. He seems to be suggesting this, I go all Hegel and let this stuff be positive, negative, back and forth in these ways. Rather dialectically, Bakhtin would say dialogically, all over this land, without the hammer and the sickle so much, here in America, of course. So you basically have a whole lot of thought in a small little quote here. But this is one of the places, actually, I have to say, where being somebody who likes subjectivity a decent amount and being decently left-wing, Democritus actually says, no, don't learn as much as you think. Think more than you learn, which I have to say, that is definitely being a bit progressive and negative and skeptical about human thought and into the subjectivity. Certainly, if you think thinking is more important than learning, you do not value so much the older ways of things. This is all how skeptical Democritus is, in spite of being very committed to the position that atoms are objective and rational. Very much like Heraclitus is a forerunning skeptic who says, no, but fire is the fundamental element. These guys believe in things while they also argue, but this is also human subjective truth. Let's be clear, but it's also this form and such. These are the problems back and forth with any human thought and thinker, and you can wrestle with that as you work into each and every one. And it is awesome. He says, Democritus further argued, attachment to worldly things and undisciplined anger brings destruction. Democritus said that scratching an itch gives the same pleasure as sex, and that desire for wealth is worse than poverty, downplaying physical pleasure. While well-bred animals have strong bodies, excellent people have great minds, again putting the mental over the physical, and putting very much the thought over the learning. So it seems to be, again, set form is not nearly as important as change or thinking. So the things necessary for life can be easily found, and it is only unnecessary things, which is very Taoist for Democritus to argue, that bring us great pain and misery in life. It also sounds a lot like Diogenes, who's coming here very soon, that he also, but he's different in ways that are obscene. So let's not talk about that right now. Let's talk about that next. We'll get into horrible things and still mark the video for children when we get into Diogenes, which I'll have to do carefully to stay online and keep it rather clean rather than blue. With the mother ducks, etc., and keeping the language all in line. So this does not mean that you should not indulge in pleasure or obscenity. As he says, a life without a feast is a long road without an inn, which is an excellent expression and saying. But you should not be unbalanced. This is very Epicureans, as well as Jains and Buddhists and Hindus would believe similar things. It's not about, the Jains would be very anti-pleasure, though. But life is more, Buddha would say, versus the Jains is much more balance. He does say, Democritus says, violent appetite blinds the soul to everything else. There is a Taoist saying, Taoist story of Middle Taoism, that a man in the marketplace one day just grabbed a bunch of gold from a gold dealer and ran away in broad daylight, which is golden sunlight, of course, the greater gold. And when the cops caught him and they asked him, hey, what are you doing? Like, why did you do that? And the guy told him in the Taoist, the guy tells the cops in the simple Chinese story, at the time, I didn't see any of the people around me. I only saw the gold. That would be violent appetite blinds the soul to everything else, including all the others. Profit in full public daylight, public agora square. Profiting from doing wrong is the worst of evils, according to Democritus. Similar to Confucius, again, Democritus said one should examine one's own mistakes rather than those of others, and that the truly strong person is not one who conquers enemies, but conquers the self and the passions. Conquering the self, in the Tao Te Ching, it says, those who conquer others are strong. Those who conquer themselves have true strength. That is one of the sayings you find throughout the world's wisdom. Dealing with others and chumps, sure. Getting yourself in a row, that is first and foremost important. Jesus has a lot of sayings exactly like that. So, good, deep wisdom for the human soul, self, and mind. Rather than pray to the gods, improving the self brings the contention one should ask for. The gods are not real, but there is a lot in ancient philosophy which is critical of traditional religious practices, not in telling people to not do religious practices, which is somehow how folks who aren't so into religion interpret it often, or have. There are academic folks who aren't so into traditional religion. They have looked at it, these are philosophers breaking into the secular. Of course, like with our own culture, we don't find people simply breaking past the traditions and systems they believe in. What we find is these are people who believe in these things and in the gods. They also believe, but it's different from how people have been seeing it. And let me try to push you guys along with all of that. So he is saying, like with Taoists and Confucius, with feed people, and then you can feed spirits, the gods will be happy and the spirits will be happy if we're better with human beings, and then we can worry about making them not unhappy with the storms and the rituals later. It does not explicitly say spells and rituals are useless, and I doubt many of these people would not say that explicitly and entirely. Originally, Democritus argued human beings were equal, living a simple life devoid of language or technology in which they had to band together against wild beasts. That's very Taoist as well. They believe we should more so retain our hippie-ishness or get back into that in the woods somewhat. They slowly, people, made discoveries by trial and error, learning to build shelter, make fire, farm crops, raise livestock, and communicate. Democritus saw himself as an heir to this continuing project, the development of civilization. So he's not that Taoist in that. The Taoists would say return back to that beast-like state because that's better. The Taoists say as soon as we have good thinkers and rulers, that means most people are terrible. Whereas Democritus himself thinks we should further civilize. That itself, whether or not one thinks we should further science politic or one thinks we have done that plenty, we'll do that differently, but we've done that plenty, is a very modern issue in modern thought you find on all sides of the aisles in many interesting, complicated ways, because it's people distrusting and trusting politics, science, religion, their fellow human beings and themselves, distrusting themselves, improving themselves versus the other. All of these things are triangulation of the self with trust and meaning and truth with others. So Democritus says that human beings became civilized by imitating animals, which is a fascinating thought. He says we learned to weave from spiders, learned to sing from birds, and we learned to build buildings from watching birds' nests. I am not sure if ancient Greece was sadly devoid of beavers or not, but they could have watched the beavers as well and learned to build longhouses, etc. Not sure of how much we did imitate nature so simply in developing weapons, etc., but that is certainly a source, isn't it? After Plato and Aristotle, we will get into Epicurus and the Stoics, who borrowed much from Democritus and the Atomists, including both atoms and the ideal of modern moderation in life. I almost said modernism in life. That's wrong. It is through Epicurus and Aristotle that Democritus' thought became influential on later periods. And later Pyrrhonists, the skeptics, saw Democritus and Xenophanes and Zeno and Heraclitus particularly as forerunners of their own skepticism and subjectivity. Like Heraclitus, who said nature loves to hide, Democritus said, in reality, we know nothing, for truth is in the depths, arguing that we must remind ourselves that we are always relatively removed from the reality that surrounds us. My favorite Zen master, Joshu in Japanese, Zhaoshu in Chinese, in Tang Dynasty China, was asked by a monk, what is the depth of the deep? Which is an interesting new way of, they are constantly slapping people for coming up and just asking them the true meaning of Buddhism like the last jerk. So Joshu tells this monk who asks, what is the depth of the deep? Your questioning me is the depth of the deep, which makes it sound a matter of semantics and emotion as to what depth is here. Many postmodernists would say there is no depth, all is quite on the surface, which sounds a bit Buddhistic. In reality, we know nothing, for truth is in the depths, says Democritus. How far can one question how many roads must a man go down as Bob Dylan learns how to sing in a Cadillac commercial? It's not relatively clear. However, the world continues, and things continue to be so deep, man, and things continue to infinitely regress beyond our knowledges. I remember actually, speaking of Democritus and knowledges, and like Locke is plural, there was an image I saw online. Somebody made some meme out of a guide for helping people and calling some sort of hotline. And in the image, there is a woman talking to another woman on the phone. And she says, I think my son may be dabbling with postmodernism. He just used the word knowledges in the plural. And the woman on the end of the phone says, ask him about the humus, mention human nature and watch his reaction. Because, of course, a postmodernist would be like, human nature isn't just one thing. It's all interconnected. So, similar to this, it's nature loves to hide. Things keep their secrets. Truth is in the depths for Democritus. And Democritus said, the world is change, life is opinion. And he said, the world is a stage, life is our entrance. You came, you saw, you left. It's a little less empirical and empire building than Julius Caesar's Tsars later. I came, I saw, I conquered. Veni vidi vici, a la the Latin, romantic or not, as it were. Anyway, as this German barbarian, I am going to sign off here, and we will be getting into more Greek philosophy as we go along. So please check out my other videos, and if you are following along with a class, please do the readings. And yes, have an excellent day, and I will see you all when I see you all at some point.